I was soaked to the bone, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The Navy supply truck creaked beneath me as the Virginia highway transformed into a river of ink-black rain. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the relentless storm for an instant, revealing the slick, winding ribbon of asphalt ahead. Wind howled through the trees, bending them as if the world itself was being tested, and the wipers slapped furiously, struggling against the torrent, a rhythm that echoed my own racing heartbeat. It was past midnight. The last leg of a 16-hour resupply run back to Norfolk Base stretched before me, a test of endurance as much as skill. My uniform was soaked, sticking to me uncomfortably, boots filled with cold water. My name is Lieutenant Emily Hayes, U.S. Navy Logistics Division, and that night I believed the only battle I faced was against exhaustion. I was wrong. Through the gray haze, faint flickers appeared, a pair of hazard lights nearly swallowed by rain somewhere between Franklin and Suffolk. At first, I thought it was debris or a stranded truck. Then I realized the outline of a dark SUV, hood up, taillights dim. The Navy manual in my glove compartment screamed protocol, no unauthorized stops during classified transport. Obedience is everything. My conscience whispered otherwise. As I slowed, a figure emerged through the sheets of water, a man waving his arms frantically. Behind him, I caught glimpses of a woman and a small child pressed together against the fogged interior of the SUV. Fear gripped my stomach, twisting it into knots. Civilians stranded in a Category 2 storm. My mind urged me on, keep driving. Base is 30 miles, report later, but my hand didn't press the accelerator. Instead, I guided the truck onto the shoulder, hazard lights cutting through the gray blur. The wind and rain screamed in my ears, but I forced myself to step out, pulling the poncho tight around my soaked body. The man shouted over the storm, voice breaking, "Engines dead, no signal." I nodded, motioning him back. "Stay with your family, sir, I'll check." Kneeling in the mud, flashlight slicing through rising steam, I saw the heart of the problem, fried wires, smoking coolant. Nothing would start tonight. I trudged back, mud sucking at my boots. "You're not getting anywhere tonight. Nearest tower is closed. Next town 20 miles. The man's face fell. "We'll freeze out here," he muttered. "Not if I could help it." From the back of the truck, I hauled chains, heavy-duty, Navy standard for rough terrain. The man tried to protest. "Sir, consider this a logistics exercise," I said, a half-smile breaking through the storm's tension. The SUV's tires were hooked to the truck, chains groaning under the strain. The rain plastered my uniform to my skin, boots squelched with every step. I climbed into the cab, checked the rearview mirror, headlights faintly reflected off wet asphalt. "All right," I muttered, "let's get you home." We crawled down the empty highway, the CB radio crackling with his intermittent voice. "Still there, Lieutenant?" I answered, "Still here. Hang tight." 40 minutes later, a faint glow appeared, a roadside motel like a beacon in the storm. Relief washed over me. I parked, unhooked the chains, and checked the SUV one last time. The man stepped out, drenched, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I don't have much cash, at least let me pay for fuel." I shook my head. "Get your family warm, that's all that matters." He studied me for a moment, memorizing my face. "Lieutenant Hayes? Emily Hayes," he nodded slowly. "You've done more than you know." Climbing back into my truck, lightning cut the night, casting a halo around the man's silhouette by the motel sign. I waved, he waved back. Base gates appeared near dawn, fog clinging to the asphalt. The sentry's salute barely registered. "Rough night, ma'am," I forced a tired smile, murmuring, "You could say that." Inside the logistics hangar, the duty officer accepted my report with no comment. My uniform dripped, my hair plastered, my mind replaying the child's fearful eyes, the man's trembling handshake. Protocol had been broken, yes, but I wouldn't have driven past. A note waited on my desk, report to Captain Briggs, 700 sharp, trouble. Fatigue hit like a tidal wave as I trudged to my quarters, images of the night haunting me. Somewhere in a roadside motel, a family was safe. Somewhere else, a report with my name was being written. Morning came too soon. My uniform still damp, I stood outside Captain Briggs's office, dreading the encounter. The door clicked open. "You're up," barked his aide. I straightened my jacket, saluted, and entered. Captain Briggs barely looked up. A formal reprimand slid across the desk. Disobedience of Standing Order 7A, no civilian interaction during active transport. Yes, sir, I said quietly. His voice was sharp, each syllable a blade. You jeopardized classified cargo, compromised our timeline. With respect, sir, I countered. There was a family stranded in the storm, a child. He slammed a pen down. A child does not override Navy protocol. Silence filled the room. The framed motto, order, duty, precision, glared down at me. You've been one of our better officers, Hayes, but sentiment cannot dictate logistics. You will be reassigned to base operations until further notice. Desk duty. Paperwork, no field missions, just walls and quiet. Yes, sir, I swallowed. In the hallway, Lieutenant Miller, my constant rival, smirked. Tough break, Hayes. Next time, save the world on your own time. I brushed past, sinking into the alien rhythm of keyboard taps and inventory logs. Evenings became ritualistic runs around the base perimeter, the Atlantic wind biting, bringing memories of the child's frightened face back to me. Weeks passed. Captain Briggs publicly scolded me during a morning briefing. Discipline, he declared, is precision, not charity. Whispers followed me. Miller's amusement was thinly veiled. Chief Morales, a grizzled mechanic with decades of service, found me one morning near the hangar. Rough day, ma'am, you could say that, he smoked quietly. Back in my day, I stopped a convoy once, saved a kid from a wrecked car, got written up too. Would I do it again? Always. Sometimes the uniform forgets it's worn by people. His words lingered longer than the smoke. 2 weeks into desk duty, monotony weighed heavy. Sunsets over the pier painted steel silhouettes of ships anchored, and I wondered if the family I saved had made it home. Perhaps they had forgotten me. Perhaps that was the point. Then, a morning briefing summoned me. Lieutenant Hayes, report to Admiral Warren, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. Recognition slammed into me like thunder. The man, the storm, the family. My pulse raced. Admiral Warren, silver hair glinting, calm eyes meeting mine with a faint knowing glimmer. Sir, yes, sir. He studied me, measured, unflinching. Let's talk about protocol, he said quietly. Sleep eluded me afterward. The room's tension, Briggs's polished facade, the moral weight of that night on Route 58, none of it left me. I replayed every raindrop, every chain, every flash of the child's terrified eyes. You've done more than you know, the man's voice echoed in my mind. 3 days later, we prepared for the Admiral's inspection of the base. Reports, charts, route efficiencies, fuel logistics, my life condensed into spreadsheets. Miller leaned casually against the file cabinet, smirking. Still here, Hayes? Thought you'd be discharged by now. Some metals don't need metal, I murmured. His frown deepened, confused. That night, under a clear sky, I walked along the docks. Stars reflected on still water. The base was quiet, the hum of generators the only sound. Thoughts of my father, a retired Navy chief, echoed, service isn't applause, it's conscience. Follow orders without thought and you're just a uniform. Follow what's right and you're a sailor. I had broken a rule, yes, but perhaps I had stayed a sailor. Morning arrived. Admiral Warren's convoy rolled in at precisely 900. From my office window, I saw him step out of a black sedan, posture calm, authority unspoken yet undeniable. Captain Briggs met him at the gate, practically saluting. Their voices carried faintly. I watched, silent. By mid-morning, whispers spread. He had requested specific case files, personnel evaluations, even disciplinary records. My name surfaced repeatedly. At noon, Chief Morales stopped by my desk. Waiting on a storm, Lieutenant, feels like one. He nodded, leaving me with the cryptic sailor's wisdom. Storms have a way of washing things clean. At 1400 hours, I was summoned to the command briefing room. Captain Briggs stood stiffly. Admiral Warren sat calmly, folder in hand. Lieutenant Hayes, your report says you disobeyed a standing order during active transport. Correct? Yes, sir. I had stopped to save a child, a woman, and a man in peril. Briggs jumped in, citing regulations. Warren's silence was a weight heavier than any reprimand. Was any cargo lost, injured? Mission completed? No, yes. Then the only failure, he interrupted quietly, was moral judgment. Yours or hers, I am still deciding. The room went still. Briggs's jaw tightened. Warren's presence filled the space like gravity itself. Leadership isn't who follows orders. It's who makes the right call when orders fall short. He turned to me. You made a hard call that night, Lieutenant. Yes, sir, and you'd make it again. The storm from that night still lingered in my mind, though the skies were clear now. The base bathed in a pale, washed-out sunlight that felt almost unreal after weeks of gray and rain. Admiral Warren's words echoed with an intensity that made my chest tight. Leadership isn't who follows orders, it's who makes the right call when orders fall short. I left the briefing room with a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Briggs's face was pale, every muscle in his jaw twitching as he tried to mask the storm of emotions behind his disciplined facade. Officers shifted in the hallway to avoid eye contact with him, and I felt no gloating satisfaction, only a quiet sense that something long overdue had finally begun to shift. My first order of business was to settle into the acting operations officer role Admiral Warren had assigned me. The logistics room, usually a cavern of hums and clicks from computers and printers, felt different now. Papers stacked neatly, every chart meticulously labeled, yet the silence that had felt oppressive before now seemed like an invitation to act, not just record. I sat at a terminal scanning reports and fuel distribution logs. Miller lingered nearby, still smirking, though the edge had softened slightly. Still staring at spreadsheets, he asked. I didn't answer. Some lessons aren't for him yet. Around mid-afternoon, Chief Morales leaned against a nearby counter, his grease-stained hands crossed over his chest. You look like someone who just survived a storm, he remarked, his gruff tone softened by a hint of admiration. You did more than survive, Chief, I murmured. You changed things. He nodded, his eyes distant. Sometimes that's all anyone can do, change what they can, make a difference when it counts. I wanted to believe him. By evening, I was alone, save for the occasional sound of distant generators and the muted echoes of sailors preparing for departure or returning from training exercises. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of amber and violet across the harbor. I walked down to the pier, the salt air sharp and bracing. Ships sat anchored, their steel frames glinting in the fading light. Memories of that storm, the child's terrified face, the man's pleading eyes replayed in my mind. It was then that my communicator buzzed. Lieutenant Hayes, Captain Briggs requests your presence immediately. My pulse spiked. My stomach turned as I thought of reprimands, of paperwork, of the gnawing weight of protocol. I followed the aide down the corridor, boots echoing on the polished tile. Inside Briggs's office, the air was different. He sat stiff-backed, but there was a subtle tension in the room, an anticipation that made the hairs on my arms rise. Admiral Warren was already there, reviewing a stack of files. His presence was steady, commanding, yet calm, as if he had walked through 100 storms and learned which ones mattered. Lieutenant Hayes, he said, not looking up. Sit. I obeyed, sitting with my back straight, trying to steady the rapid thrum of my heart. Briggs looked between us, confusion flickering across his face. Sir, he began, but Warren raised a hand, silencing him. 2 weeks ago, one of your officers broke protocol to save 3 lives. One of those lives belongs to my daughter. The weight of the words hit me like thunder. My thoughts spun back to that night, the rain pelting my face, the chains groaning under tension, the small, scared hands pressed against glass. Briggs's jaw tightened. Sir, Warren continued, voice calm but firm, you reprimanded her, reassigned her, and humiliated her publicly. This is what happens when order is enforced without judgment. Briggs's face paled. Sir, that's the problem, Warren said simply. Discipline without conscience is not discipline, it is cruelty. Silence filled the office. The papers on Warren's desk seemed heavier, laden with a moral gravity that no regulation could ever carry. He turned to me, eyes softening. You acted correctly, Lieutenant Hayes. You saved lives, that is leadership. I blinked, struggling to find words. I was just doing what anyone would do, sir. He shook his head gently. And that, Lieutenant, is why it matters. The Navy teaches obedience, but it must also teach judgment. You showed both. Briggs stood frozen, a statue of discipline and authority rendered powerless by the quiet force of moral truth. Effective immediately, Warren continued, Captain Briggs is relieved of command pending review and reassigned to fleet operations in D.C. Lieutenant Hayes, you are temporarily acting operations officer, overseeing all humanitarian logistics initiatives. The words hit like a tidal wave. I sat, stunned disbelief clinging to me like the damp uniform from that stormy night. Acting operations officer, real responsibility, the kind that mattered beyond spreadsheets and memos. Sir, I managed, voice barely audible, I'll do my best. Warren smiled faintly, a warmth in the gesture that was more fatherly than commanding. I know you will. You've reminded us why we wear this uniform, not for protocol alone, but for conscience. I left the office in a daze, sunlight spilling across the courtyard, the flag snapping sharply in the breeze. Everything seemed the same yet profoundly different. Ships hummed in the distance. Sailors moved about their duties. And somewhere, deep in the corridors of authority, a lesson about human decency had begun to ripple. Over the following days, the base buzzed with preparation. Admiral Warren's inspection was quiet but precise. He asked for operational case studies, personnel files, and disciplinary records. My name surfaced repeatedly. Colleagues whispered, casting glances that carried newfound respect, tinged with awe. Even Miller's smirk had softened into a cautious acknowledgement. By the afternoon of the third day, I was called to a meeting to help prepare a presentation for the Admiral. The operations room was alive with activity, charts, logistics maps, convoy routes. My team worked diligently, following instructions but looking to me for guidance. It was a strange reversal, a moment of clarity after weeks of uncertainty. Miller leaned against a cabinet, curiosity and skepticism warring across his face. "You're still here, Hayes? Thought the storm had washed you away." I met his gaze calmly. "Some metals don't need metal," I murmured, and he frowned, silent, unsure how to respond. Night fell and I returned to the pier, the water calm, reflecting the stars like tiny beacons. The storm's memory lingered, but its terror had faded, replaced by clarity. I remembered my father's words. "A uniform doesn't make you honorable. You do." That night, I had acted as my father had hoped any sailor would, with conscience guiding my hands as much as duty guided my heart. Morning arrived with crisp sunlight cutting through lingering clouds. Flags were raised, boots polished, brass shining. Admiral Warren's convoy rolled in exactly at 900, precision meeting anticipation. From my office, I watched him step from a black sedan, his presence calm, authoritative without being overbearing. He moved with the ease of someone who had seen storms of every kind, weather, politics, war, and human failings. Captain Briggs met him at the gate, practically saluting before the door opened. I watched silently as the two men spoke, their voices carrying faintly, a backdrop to my own racing thoughts. By mid-morning, whispers spread. Warren requested specific case files, personnel evaluations, and disciplinary records. My name appeared frequently. At noon, Chief Morale stopped by. "Waiting on a storm, Lieutenant." "Feels like one," I replied. He nodded toward the window. "Storms have a way of washing things clean," he said, leaving the statement suspended in the air. At 1400 hours, I reported to the command briefing room. The tension was palpable, the room lined with senior officers. Briggs stood rigid at the head of the table, Warren at the far end. My chest tightened as I straightened my back in assumed attention. "Lieutenant Hayes, your report says you disobeyed a standing order during active transport. Correct?" Warren asked calmly. "Yes, sir." I had stopped to save a family caught in a storm. Briggs jumped in, citing regulations, authority, chain of command. Warren's silence was heavier than any reprimand. "Was any cargo lost? Injured? Mission completed?" No, yes." Then the only failure, he interrupted, was moral judgment, yours or hers. "I am still deciding." The room went still. Briggs's jaw tightened. Warren's presence was like gravity, inescapable, undeniable. Leadership isn't measured by obedience alone. It is measured by the courage to do what is right when rules fall short. He turned to me. "You made a hard call, Lieutenant Hayes." "Yes, sir," I said, voice low. "And you'd make it again," he affirmed. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a rare reprieve from the constant gray that had dominated the past weeks. I arrived at the operations office early, my uniform crisp, ribbons aligned, and my chest still tight with the echo of Admiral Warren's words, acting operations officer. The title still felt surreal, yet the weight of responsibility settled comfortably on my shoulders, heavier than any insignia. The office was alive with movement, keyboards clattering, phones ringing, and printers spitting out reports. My team looked to me with a mixture of curiosity, uncertainty, and cautious respect. The air was tense, but not oppressive. For the first time in weeks, I felt the currents of authority and conscience flowing together, guiding rather than restraining. Miller approached, leaning casually against a filing cabinet. "Still alive, Hayes?" he teased, though the edge of mockery had softened. I allowed a small smile. "Still learning, Miller, still learning." I spent the morning reviewing convoy routes, disaster response protocols, and fuel allocations. Each report told a story: roads impassable, towns cut off, communities waiting for aid. It was a stark reminder that every decision carried weight beyond spreadsheets. The lesson from that stormy night on Route 58 had transformed from personal memory into operational philosophy. Lives mattered more than lines on a form. By mid-morning, an aide delivered a note. Admiral Warren requested a brief, informal meeting. My pulse quickened. A quiet corner office, usually reserved for senior personnel, now awaited me. I straightened my jacket, smoothed my hair, and walked with deliberate steps, every motion measured yet calm. Warren's office was bathed in sunlight filtering through high windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. He stood by a map of the East Coast, fingers tracing routes and logistics networks. The sight was grounding. He was a man of action, even in quiet observation. "Lieutenant Hayes," he began, turning with a faint smile, "thank you for coming." I saluted, then sat in the chair he gestured toward. "Sir, it's my honor." He regarded me for a moment, quiet, reflective. "I imagine you're wondering why you were chosen for this role." I nodded, careful to keep my expression neutral. "More than anything, I want someone who understands the balance between rules and humanity," he continued. "Your actions on Route 58 showed judgment beyond orders, and that is exactly what this base and this Navy needs." The words hung in the air. I tried to find the right response, but silence felt more fitting. "Leadership isn't always about rank," he added softly. "Sometimes it's about seeing a storm through someone else's eyes and choosing courage over compliance." We reviewed current operations, contingency plans, and disaster response protocols. Every route, fuel depot, and supply hub passed under our scrutiny. Warren's questions weren't about efficiency alone. They probed judgment, anticipating scenarios where rules might conflict with human welfare. I realized that my years of field experience, the countless miles spent navigating convoys, and the stormy night's decision were all being tested, not for compliance but for moral insight. After a long session, he leaned back, clasped his hands, and studied me. "Do you know why I requested this meeting? To guide operations under your supervision, sir." I ventured cautiously. "Partly," he said. "Mostly I want to ensure that lessons like yours ripple outward, that officers understand courage is part of discipline." A knock interrupted us and Captain Briggs was ushered in. His face, usually a mask of control, now reflected restrained tension. "Sir," he began, "if this is about the audit." Warren raised a hand, silencing him. "Captain Briggs, 2 weeks ago, one of your officers acted to save lives despite orders. You reprimanded her." I intervened. Briggs's posture stiffened. "Sir, regulations are clear, and so are moral imperatives," Warren countered. "There is a difference, and it is crucial that every officer understands it." Briggs's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. Warren turned to me. "Lieutenant Hayes, you acted correctly. That is why you are now guiding this base's humanitarian logistics. Consider it restitution, not for punishment but for principle." I nodded, overwhelmed yet grounded. "I understand, sir. I will do my best." Warren's expression softened. "That is enough. You don't need accolades for doing what's right. But the Navy will remember your choice, and it will shape policy moving forward." After he left, the office felt lighter, infused with purpose rather than fear. I walked to the pier once more, the harbor calm, the sun reflecting on water like molten gold. Ships rested silently, shadows stretching long across the tarmac. I remembered that night, the rain, the cold, the small family trapped in a broken vehicle. The memory was no longer guilt-laden. It was a quiet affirmation of conscience in action. Over the next days, I threw myself into operations. I supervised convoy scheduling, coordinated with civilian agencies, and reviewed disaster response protocols. Each decision was measured, yet informed by the storm that had taught me the most: humanity must never be sacrificed for rigid adherence to orders. Miller appeared in the operations room more often now, lingering with curiosity instead of skepticism. "You're good at this," he admitted one afternoon. I allowed a small smile. "It's not about me, it's about people who rely on us when the storms hit." Chief Morales stopped by frequently, offering guidance, insight, and quiet encouragement. "You're changing things, Lieutenant," he said one evening, lighting a cigarette and exhaling smoke that caught the sunlight streaming through the window. "Not everyone gets to steer the course of conscience." I began to implement small but critical changes. a rapid response team for civilians caught in disasters, clearer guidelines balancing protocol with humanitarian judgment, and a review system ensuring officers' moral decisions were recognized rather than punished. The ethos of Route 58, the courage to act, was becoming embedded in the culture of the base. Weeks passed. The storms continued their seasonal march, each one testing our systems and patience. Hurricanes along the coast, flash floods in inland towns, and winter storms that iced highways and stranded communities. Each mission reminded me why I had chosen this life, not for accolades, but for moments that demanded courage. One afternoon, a letter arrived on my desk. The handwriting was familiar, old-fashioned, careful. It was from Captain Rhett Briggs. "Commander Hayes," it began, "I've followed the program you're running. You were right, I was wrong. I applied for a volunteer position with the Red Cross. Perhaps it's time I learn what real logistics means." I set the letter down slowly, a quiet satisfaction washing over me. The storms would continue, but for the first time I felt a sense of closure, a reassurance that conscience and courage could endure in a system built for order. The first anniversary of Project Samaritan approached. Admiral Warren returned to the base quietly, insisting on no ceremony, no formal speeches, just a walk through the operations hangar. Trucks gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each bearing the blue and gold Samaritan emblem. "You did this," he said softly, turning to me. "You took one act of decency and built a doctrine." "You did, sir," I replied. "I only followed the map you drew." He chuckled. "Maps are useless without someone brave enough to drive the road." We stood on the pier afterward, watching the sun sink over the harbor, the water molten gold in its glow. "How many people pass through life without realizing they've made a difference?" he asked, his voice low, carrying decades of experience and observation. I thought of Route 58, of the small family in danger. "I wasn't thinking about difference," I said softly. "I just saw people who needed help." "Exactly," he said, voice carrying across the calm water, "and that is why it mattered." He paused, then in a voice that carried authority without pomp, "The Navy runs on rules, Commander, but it survives on people like you." I saluted. He returned it, crisp, perfect, eyes reflecting the fading light. Before leaving, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a grainy but clear photo taken from motel security the night of the storm. My headlights cutting through rain, the stranded SUV beside me, rain streaking through the darkness like silver threads. On the back, a single line in his careful handwriting, "For when the storms return, so you remember what courage looks like in the dark." I framed it on my desk, a quiet reminder of what it meant to act. Months later, another hurricane struck the Carolinas. I drove again, the wheel familiar beneath my hands, the road and purpose clear. My team followed in convoy, roads flooded, power lines down, communities half submerged. At the first shelter, an elderly woman clasped my hands, tears glistening in her eyes. "You came for us when no one else did." Her words carried me back to that night, the father's voice, the child's frightened eyes. "You've done more than you know." Perhaps kindness did circle back in ways we never saw. Sitting by the truck afterward, watching clouds drift apart over the harbor, the air rich with the scent of wet earth and diesel, I thought of every mentor, every storm, every lesson learned. My father, Chief Morales, Admiral Warren, even Captain Briggs, each had shaped the compass I carried. A gentle breeze tugged at the flag overhead. I whispered, "I, sir," not to anyone but to the memory of storms past and the choices they demanded. Honor, I realized, wasn't loud. It didn't demand recognition or revenge. It waited quietly steady until the right choice was made. The sun set behind the hangars, casting the harbor in a golden glow. I looked toward my office, the framed photo catching the light. "One act of mercy can change an entire chain of command," I murmured. Then, with the same calm resolve that had once made me stop on Route 58, I picked up my pen and signed the next mission order. For those who had once worn the uniform or who simply believed in doing right when no one was looking, this story was for them. And if it reached even one person, teaching them that kindness and courage mattered more than convenience, it was enough. The following week settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in months. Acting operations officer came with responsibilities that demanded attention from sunrise to sunset, yet the work felt purposeful. grounded in the knowledge that each decision, each route approved, each supply delivery could mean the difference between safety and disaster. The operations room was alive with motion and chatter, but there was a notable shift in energy. Officers who had once avoided eye contact now nodded as I passed, and junior personnel approached with questions, eager to learn not just the procedure but the reasoning behind it. Morale was quietly transforming, anchored by the principle Warren had instilled: rules serve people, not the other way around. Miller, ever the observer, lingered near the coffee station more than usual. "You've got the base in a new rhythm, Hayes," he said one morning, handing me a fresh cup. There was a note of respect in his voice, tempered with the faint humor that always lingered behind his words. "Thank you," I said quietly. "It's not me, it's the crew and the culture we're building." Chief Morale stopped by mid-morning, leaning on the doorway with a cigarette in hand, eyes tracing the flow of officers moving through the operations floor. "You've got a storm of your own brewing here," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not of rain or wind, but of ideas. People are starting to think for themselves, and they're listening to you." I nodded, absorbing the weight of the comment. Leadership wasn't measured in orders shouted or reports filed. It was in influence, in shaping the decisions of others, and most critically, in instilling courage. The phone buzzed, a sharp, insistent sound cutting through the hum of operations. An incoming message from the Eastern Coastal Division. A small town cut off by flash floods needed immediate supply delivery. The request came with tight constraints. Roads were unstable, bridges compromised, and the weather unpredictable. I gathered my convoy team immediately, laying out maps, routes, and contingencies. Each officer, civilian coordinator, and driver watched intently as I detailed the mission. "This isn't just a run for supplies," I emphasized. "This is a chance to prevent loss, to ensure families stay safe. Follow the protocol, but remember, human life trumps paperwork." The convoy moved at first light. The highway had been carved by the recent storms into treacherous ruts and flooded lanes. Water lapped at tires, and fallen trees and debris littered the shoulders. Yet the team moved with precision, and the lessons of Route 58 were alive in every decision I made. We stopped briefly to reinforce a collapsed bridge with temporary supports and rerouted around sections that were too dangerous to traverse. By mid-afternoon, we arrived at the town. Families huddled in schools, gyms, and community centers, their faces drawn with worry and relief when our convoy pulled in. Children clung to their parents, eyes wide, some brimming with tears. One elderly man grasped my hand, shaking, his voice cracking. "You came through for us when no one else could." In that moment, I felt the weight of all the storms, all the miles, all the choices culminating into something tangible. The rain-soaked highways, the long nights, the moral dilemmas, they had prepared me for this. This was what mattered. Returning to base, the sun broke through low-hanging clouds, casting golden light across the water. The convoy moved in quiet formation, engines humming, supplies secure. Inside my truck, I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. Admiral Warren's words echoed in my mind: "Rules serve people, or they serve nothing." Weeks passed, punctuated by more missions, each one testing judgment, adaptability, and moral clarity. Hurricanes, winter storms, sudden flash floods. My team responded swiftly, but always with the principle that no procedure would overshadow the imperative to act when lives were at stake. One evening, back at the base, I received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a note in crisp handwriting: "Commander Hayes, the family you saved on Route 58 is doing well. They have spoken often of your calm in the storm. Your choice made a lasting difference. Admiral Warren." I held the note in my hands, a quiet warmth spreading through me. It was proof, not of personal heroism, but of the ripple effect that one act of conscience could have. The photograph included showed the SUV, headlights slicing through rain like twin lances of silver. The image was simple, but its meaning was profound. Courage mattered even in the smallest, most private moments. The following morning, as I entered the operations office, I found a young officer waiting by my desk, clipboard in hand. "Commander Hayes," she began, voice steady, "I have a question about a scenario I encountered yesterday. Orders conflicted with a civilian emergency. How should I respond?" I smiled gently, handing her the Samaritan rule plaque on my wall. Any officer who stops to render aid, even in violation of orders, will not be punished if lives are saved. Follow your conscience, I said, and document everything clearly. Life comes first, protocol comes second. Her eyes widened with relief and comprehension. She nodded, inspired, and returned to her duties with a newfound clarity. This was the legacy of that stormy night, the seed of humane leadership spreading quietly across the base. Later that week, Admiral Warren returned for a brief visit. We walked the perimeter together, observing the operations floor, discussing upcoming missions, and quietly sharing insights about leadership and judgment. You've taken one night, one decision, and built an enduring culture around it, he said, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of decades of service. I only did what anyone with a conscience should have done, I replied softly. Perhaps, he said, smiling faintly, but it takes someone brave enough to act when the moment demands it. That bravery now guides others, that's why it matters. A week later, we received reports of a hurricane brewing along the mid-Atlantic coast. Roads were vulnerable, towns isolated, and emergency services stretched thin. I assembled the team, reviewing evacuation routes, supply drops, and civilian coordination. The storm promised to test us, but for the first time I didn't feel fear. Preparedness, judgment, and humanity guided every decision. On the first day of the storm, the convoy moved with precision through flooded highways, navigating debris and broken bridges. I drove alongside my team, headlights cutting through sheets of rain, hands steady on the wheel. Every turn, every stop, every detour was a choice informed by experience and conscience. We reached a coastal town cut off from emergency services. Families crowded school gyms and community centers, anxious, scared, but not abandoned. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed, frightened, yet comforted by the presence of the Navy convoy. We delivered food, water, blankets, and medical supplies. Elderly residents grasped our hands, shaking, thanking us over and over. The memory of that night on Route 58 surged forward. The father's eyes, the child's small hands, the huddled family, it all came rushing back. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to recognize the weight of what we were doing and the responsibility entrusted to me. After the deliveries, I drove back toward base, rain still falling, the horizon barely visible through the storm. Yet inside the truck there was a quiet satisfaction. Each mile, each choice reaffirmed that the course of honor wasn't measured in medals or reprimands, but in the courage to act when it mattered most. At base, I filed reports, updated logs, and ensured every officer documented their decisions clearly. My team looked to me, their eyes reflecting trust and admiration. This is what leadership looks like, I thought, not dictating every action but guiding, teaching, and empowering them to act rightly. That evening, as I walked along the pier, the storm easing into a drizzle, I paused to watch the harbor. Ships swayed gently in the currents, reflecting the dim lights of the base. I remembered my father's words, "The uniform doesn't make you honorable, you make the uniform honorable." I realized that the journey from Route 58 to this point wasn't just about following orders or breaking rules. It was about embedding conscience into every decision, every mile, every mission. And for the first time, I understood fully, honor was quiet, steady, and enduring. I looked at the framed photo of the SUV and my headlights cutting through the storm. I smiled faintly. One act of courage can ripple outward, I whispered, changing lives, policy, and culture. And in that quiet moment, watching the water glint with the last light of day, I understood that storms, both literal and moral, would continue. But with conscience as our compass, courage as our engine, and humanity as our guide, we could navigate them all. The next morning, the base stirred to the familiar rhythm of engines, boots, and orders, but there was an unspoken change in the air. Officers moved with quiet confidence, their steps less burdened by hesitation. Even the new recruits who had joined with eyes wide at the thought of naval discipline now carried a subtle pride in the work they were doing. Each knew that the Navy could demand rigor, but it also demanded conscience, and that balance was now tangible in every corner of the operations center. I started my day reviewing the reports from the recent hurricane mission. Each officer had documented their decisions, the reasons for deviations from standard protocol, and the outcomes. It was a wealth of information, a testament to the effectiveness of combining procedure with moral judgment. I traced the routes, noting where alternative decisions had saved time or lives, marking them for inclusion in a new operations handbook we were drafting under Admiral Warren's guidance. Mid-morning, a message flashed on my screen. Urgent, small coastal community reports sudden levee breach. Immediate response required. My pulse quickened not with fear but anticipation. Each challenge was an opportunity to put our principles into practice, to guide my team through uncertainty with a steady hand. I assembled the convoy and laid out the situation. "Levee has breached," I said, tracing the water's advance on a map. "Evacuation in progress, but roads are unstable. We will deliver essential supplies and ensure everyone reaches safe zones. Follow instructions carefully, but remember, if human life is at risk, act accordingly." The convoy rolled out, headlights piercing through the early fog. Rain from overnight storms left the roads slick, debris scattered across shoulders and fallen power lines crisscrossing key routes. The team maneuvered cautiously, but each driver moved with purpose, their decisions guided not just by procedure, but by the lessons embedded in every mile traveled. By noon, we arrived at the town. Families huddled in gymnasiums, elementary schools, and community centers, anxious but relieved to see the Navy convoy arriving. I met with the town coordinator, reviewing evacuation priorities and identifying vulnerable residents. Children clutched blankets, faces pale from fear but brightened by relief, while elderly residents leaned heavily on our assistance, hands shaking as they grasped mine. One man, tears streaking his rain-soaked face, whispered, "You came for us even when no one else could." I nodded, feeling a quiet swell of satisfaction. The memory of Route 58 flashed through my mind, the father, the child, the stranded family, and I realized that every mile we drove since that night had been preparation for this moment. After ensuring everyone was safely relocated, I returned to my truck. The convoy followed, engines humming in quiet unity. Each officer moved with a quiet competence, confident in judgment, grounded in principle. As we drove back, the horizon began to clear, sunlight glinting off wet asphalt, casting the storm-tossed landscape in a shimmering light. Back at base, I filed detailed reports, documenting the deviations from standard procedures, the decisions made, and the lives saved. I included recommendations for future missions, emphasizing that judgment guided by conscience must be recognized and supported. The team gathered in the operations room, their faces reflecting pride, relief, and an understanding that the work we were doing was bigger than any individual. Later that afternoon, I walked along the pier, the storm finally passed. The harbor shimmered in the late sunlight, ships resting silently against the current, their reflections fracturing gently across the water. The air was filled with the scent of salt and diesel, a comforting familiarity after weeks of chaos. Chief Morales appeared at my side, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, eyes on the water. "You're shaping this base, Hayes," he said, voice low but firm. "Not just logistics, but morale. You've shown that conscience and command can coexist and people notice." I nodded, letting the words settle. "It's not about recognition," I thought. "It's about setting the standard, creating a culture where moral courage is expected, not feared." That evening, an envelope was delivered to my desk. Inside was a letter from Admiral Warren. "Commander Hayes, your decisions during the hurricane response exemplify the principles of humane leadership we discussed. The documentation will be incorporated into training modules. Thank you for demonstrating that the Navy's strength lies not only in ships and supplies, but in the hearts of those who serve." I set the letter down, feeling a rare warmth that wasn't tied to promotion or recognition, but to the knowledge that the lessons of Route 58 had now become institutional. The storm that had shaped my decisions had left a legacy, and it was now guiding others. Weeks passed. Each mission, each convoy, each delivery of humanitarian aid reinforced the principle that had become the foundation of our operations. From hurricanes to winter storms, from flood-stricken towns to isolated communities, the message was clear: life and conscience must guide every decision, even when it challenges protocol. One afternoon, I was reviewing supply logs when Miller approached, unusually quiet. He leaned on the edge of my desk, eyes tracing the spreadsheets before looking at me. "Hayes," he said slowly, "I didn't realize what you did until now. You've changed the way people think around here." I smiled faintly. It wasn't just me, it was everyone who followed the lead, you included. He nodded, a rare softness in his expression. Maybe there's hope for this base after all. The memory of that night on Route 58 never left me. The father's eyes, the child's hands pressed against the fogged glass, the way the storm had made time stretch and compress all at once. These images remained vivid, guiding me, reminding me of the stakes. That night had been a crucible, testing my judgment, courage, and humanity. And it had reshaped the path not just for me, but for everyone I influenced. One morning, a notification arrived from the East Coast Humanitarian Division. A large-scale emergency simulation was scheduled. It was designed to train officers to respond under chaotic conditions, testing both protocol and judgment. I was assigned to oversee it. The irony wasn't lost on me. What had begun as a moral gamble on a rainy highway was now a formal training exercise, influencing the next generation of naval officers. The exercise commenced at dawn. Officers navigated flood simulations, transport challenges, and logistical puzzles. Each scenario was designed to test not just knowledge but the moral compass guiding their decisions. I observed quietly, offering guidance only when necessary, allowing them to confront the same dilemmas I had faced, yet prepared with the foundation of conscience and training. During a particularly intense scenario involving a simulated stranded family, I watched a junior officer hesitate, torn between following protocol and providing aid. I approached, quietly asking, "What does your conscience tell you?" He looked up, eyes wide. "To help them, sir." I nodded, allowing him to act. The simulation unfolded successfully, and afterward the officer approached me, gratitude evident in his stance. "Thank you, Commander, I understand now." I smiled, quietly proud. This was the ripple effect in action. The influence of one act of moral courage spreading outward, shaping decisions, guiding judgment, and reinforcing the principle that the Navy's strength lay as much in conscience as in discipline. Later that day, I walked the pier alone, the wind off the Atlantic sharp but invigorating. Ships rested against the horizon, their steel silhouettes reflecting the fading sun. The storms of spring were approaching, and with them, inevitable challenges. Yet I felt ready. Route 58 had taught me that courage was not about glory or recognition, it was about doing the right thing even when no one was watching. A young officer approached, hesitant but determined. "Commander Hayes, can I ask, how do you decide when to break protocol?" I thought for a moment, recalling the night, the rain, the child's eyes. "Listen to your conscience," I said quietly. "Rules exist for a reason, but humanity exists for a greater one. When lives are at risk, let your judgment guide your actions. And document every decision clearly. Courage without accountability is just recklessness." The officer nodded, absorbing the lesson. I watched as he returned to his duties, confidence now tempered with wisdom. This was why the storms, the long nights, the moral choices mattered, not for recognition, but for influence. For every officer who would face a similar crossroads in the future, the memory of Route 58 and the principles it embodied would serve as their compass. That evening, I returned to my quarters and looked at the framed photograph from that night. The SUV, the rain-slicked road, my headlights cutting through the storm. The father, mother, and child huddled safely inside, oblivious to the ripple of consequences their safety would set in motion. I traced the outline of my hands in the glass, remembering the feel of their grip, the small weight of responsibility resting on my shoulders. I whispered softly to the memory, "This is why it mattered. This is why we lead with conscience." The wind off the Atlantic carried a hint of calm, a quiet reassurance that the lessons of storms, both literal and moral, would endure. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax, to breathe in the salt air, and to know that courage, judgment, and humanity were guiding the officers who would follow in my path. The storms would return, they always did. But so would the knowledge that leadership wasn't just measured by reports or medals, but by the quiet, unrecognized acts that saved lives and shaped character. The following week, a call came through from Admiral Warren himself. The East Coast had been hit by an unexpected flash flood. Roads were washed out, communications intermittent, and entire neighborhoods isolated. I immediately mobilized our convoy, briefing my team as I pored over satellite maps and emergency reports. The air buzzed with urgency, there was no time for hesitation. As we drove out, I glanced at each officer behind the wheel. I had trained them not only in logistics but in decision-making under pressure. Each knew that following orders was essential, but that moral judgment was paramount when lives hung in the balance. I felt a quiet pride knowing that Route 58 had left an indelible mark not only on me but on the culture of this base. The storm clouds had returned, low and oppressive over the Virginia coast. The wind drove sheets of rain against the convoy, turning the roads into slick rivers. Debris, fallen trees, downed power lines, and scattered vehicles created hazards at every turn. My headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating waterlogged roads like a trail through darkness. At mile 12, our comms crackled with a panicked voice. A school bus was stranded on a side road, water creeping around its tires. Children were trapped inside. "Routes blocked, Commander," the junior officer reported. "I don't know if we can reach them." I gripped the wheel, rain dripping from my helmet, heart pounding. "We can," I said, voice steady. "We will. Prepare the chains and winches. We're clearing the path, whatever it takes. Safety first, speed second, but we move." The convoy slowed as I maneuvered around fallen trees, the trucks groaning against the weight of waterlogged asphalt. Using the chains, we hauled debris aside, working in sync as a single unit. Rain soaked through gloves and jackets, boots squelched in mud, but no one wavered. There was no room for fear, there was only action. Finally, the bus came into view. The driver, drenched and trembling, waved desperately. Children's faces pressed against the windows, eyes wide with terror. Parents had abandoned hope. I climbed onto the bumper of our lead truck, shouting instructions over the roar of the storm. My team followed every command, expertly securing the bus and maneuvering it back onto safer ground. Once the children were evacuated to a temporary shelter, I took a moment to breathe. The storm continued its assault, but the fear on the children's faces had been replaced by relief. Their parents thanked us with tears streaming down their faces, and for a brief moment, the chaos faded into something human, something profoundly grounding. Back at base, I filed a full report detailing every deviation from standard operating procedure, every improvisation required to ensure safety. Admiral Warren personally reviewed the submission, highlighting our team's quick thinking and moral courage in his notes. The report was intended not for reprimand but as a case study, a blueprint for future officers navigating impossible choices. Over the following days, after multiple rescues and aid deliveries, the team settled into a rhythm. Even amidst the chaos, morale remained high. Officers spoke openly about the decisions they had faced, debating options, discussing potential outcomes, and reflecting on the weight of their choices. The culture of the base was shifting. Discipline was no longer blind obedience but guided by conscience, intelligence, and humanity. One evening, as the floodwaters began to recede, I took a walk along the pier. The storm had passed, leaving a golden sunset glinting off the calm water. I thought of the stranded family on Route 58, the hurricane victims, the school children saved just hours ago. Each memory reinforced the idea that leadership required more than orders. It demanded courage, empathy, and judgment. Chief Morales joined me, leaning against the railing, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "You've changed a lot more than this base, Hayes," he said quietly. "You've changed the way people think about rules. Discipline without conscience is just chains. You've shown them a different way." I nodded, absorbing his words. "It's not just me, Chief, it's the team. Every officer who trusted their instincts, who acted instead of hesitated, it all adds up." But the lesson comes from those first miles on Route 58. That night was the seed, everything after is the growth. Chief Morales smiled faintly, and what a storm planted it. Weeks later, a small delegation from Washington visited the base, reviewing our recent humanitarian operations. They were impressed by the efficiency, the safety, and most importantly, the incorporation of moral judgment into every mission. Admiral Warren attended part of the review, quietly observing my team. His eyes met mine briefly, a subtle acknowledgement passing between us. No words were necessary, the message was clear. The Navy's mission was as much about humanity as it was about logistics. That evening, I received a secure call. The father from Route 58, Admiral Warren's son-in-law, wanted to speak. He thanked me personally, recounting the memories of that night, how his wife and child had been terrified, how my intervention had prevented disaster. Hearing his gratitude, I felt a quiet sense of closure. The risks taken, the reprimands endured, the hours in the storm, all had been worth it. Yet the work never stopped. The following week, another severe weather alert came through, coastal flooding predicted across multiple counties. I mobilized our team, issuing orders and ensuring that every officer understood the balance between protocol and moral judgment. Each mission, no matter how chaotic, reinforced the principles of leadership, empathy, and decision-making under pressure. During one particularly intense night operation, we rescued a nursing home staff and residents trapped by rising water. My team moved with precision, each officer trusting their training and instincts. As I guided them through the operation, I remembered my father's words: "The uniform doesn't make you honorable. You make the uniform honorable." Each action, every choice validated that lesson. Months passed. Each mission became a testament to the evolving culture I was helping to foster. Officers trained under the new doctrine, students in humanitarian logistics studied our case files, and young recruits learned that courage and conscience were as important as discipline and protocol. Route 58 had become more than a memory. It had become a foundation for operational excellence infused with humanity. One afternoon, I walked through the hangar, observing the convoy vehicles prepared for the next deployment. Each truck bore the Samaritan emblem, a symbol of moral courage in action. Officers moved efficiently, their expressions focused but calm, a reflection of the balance we had instilled. Efficiency guided by conscience, discipline tempered by empathy. A junior officer approached, hands trembling slightly. "Commander Hayes," he said, "what if we're faced with a situation like Route 58? How do we decide?" I smiled gently. "You trust your instincts, you weigh the risks, consider the rules, but never forget the human element. Sometimes the right choice isn't in the manual, sometimes it's in your heart, and always document your actions. Courage without accountability is just luck." He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. I realized then that the lessons of Route 58 were no longer mine alone. They had been passed down, absorbed, and internalized by the next generation. Evenings at the base took on a serene quality. Ships glided across the horizon, silhouetted against the dying sun. The storms of spring were unpredictable, but I no longer feared them. Each lightning flash, each gust of wind reminded me of the responsibility we carried and the courage required to act rightly. One particularly clear night, Admiral Warren joined me on the pier. "You've done well, Commander," he said, voice low, calm, yet carrying the weight of decades of service. "You've proven that leadership isn't just about orders, it's about judgment, integrity, and humanity. What you've built here will last long after the storms have passed." I nodded, watching the stars reflect in the calm harbor waters. "I just followed what I knew was right, sir." He chuckled softly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." One choice, one act of courage can change everything. That night on Route 58, that choice is still shaping the Navy today. The wind carried a hint of salt and diesel. The base was quiet, but I felt the hum of purpose, the steady heartbeat of officers ready to act not only with discipline, but with conscience. I realized then that my journey, my career, my storms, my moral crucible had created something larger than me. Months later, as I oversaw a new humanitarian mission along the East Coast, I received another letter. It was from Captain Rhett Briggs, now in a civilian logistics role. "Commander Hayes, your leadership has reshaped my understanding of responsibility and humanity. I've applied for a volunteer post with the Red Cross. Perhaps it's time I learned what real logistics and real leadership truly mean. Thank you." I set the letter down, letting the words sink. Every reprimand, every sleepless night, every decision made under pressure had led to this moment. The ripple of morality extending far beyond Route 58, beyond the storms, beyond the base itself. Standing on the pier, I looked toward the horizon. The sun was low, casting a warm glow across the water. Ships moved in orderly lines, officers prepared for deployment, and the base hummed with activity. Somewhere, storms were gathering, and somewhere, future officers would face choices I had once faced. I whispered to the memory of that rainy night, "Do the right thing, even when no one is watching." And I knew they would. Morning arrived over Norfolk Base with a quiet brilliance, the sun glinting off puddles left by the previous night's drizzle. I walked to my office, the familiar hum of the base awakening around me. The The smell of saltwater and jet fuel mingled with the fresh scent of damp earth, a reminder of the storms that both tested and defined us. I paused by the window, thinking of the countless officers now inspired by the Route 58 incident, their own consciences sharpened by the example of one decision made in the rain. Chief Laram approached, handing me a new set of assignments. "Commander Hayes," she said, her voice clipped but respectful, "you've got 3 disaster response teams under your direct oversight this week. Each location has its own challenges: coastal flooding, power outages, and supply shortages. You'll coordinate all transport logistics, prioritize life-saving missions, and ensure resource allocation is efficient." I nodded, absorbing the gravity of the responsibilities. My mind flickered briefly to Route 58, the chains, the child's frightened eyes, every image reinforcing the stakes. I responded, voice steady. "Understood, Chief. I'll coordinate with the teams and update you after each mission." The first deployment took us to a low-lying county along the Chesapeake Bay. Streets had turned to rivers, with vehicles half-submerged and families stranded in upper floors of their homes. Our trucks, equipped for rough terrain and swift water rescue, were deployed to clear paths, deliver food, and evacuate the most vulnerable. I drove the lead truck, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn fog. Rain fell intermittently, the clouds heavy with residual moisture from the previous night. Our convoy moved with precision, officers communicating via radio, directing supplies, and ensuring civilians were escorted to safe zones. I found myself recalling the initial hesitation on Route 58, the internal debate between protocol and conscience. This time, hesitation was unnecessary. Training, trust, and moral clarity guided every decision. At mile 8, a call crackled through the radio, a family trapped on a collapsed bridge, water swirling dangerously beneath. Panic laced the officer's voice. "Commander Hayes, we can't reach them." I didn't pause. "Yes, we can," I replied, my voice cutting through the storm's roar. "We'll deploy the pontoons and winches, maintain a safe distance, prioritize safety but move now." Arriving at the site, I assessed the scene. The bridge's supports had given way, but a single steel girder jutted out across the water. Using the pontoons and ropes, we stabilized a pathway. I climbed carefully, balancing against the wind, rain soaking my uniform. The family, mother, father, 2 children watched, frozen with fear, as I guided them across the makeshift bridge. Every step demanded precision, patience, and a steady heart. Once safely on solid ground, the father grabbed my arm. "Thank you," he said, voice trembling. "We didn't think anyone would come." His eyes brimmed with tears, and for a moment I felt the weight of every risk, every reprimand, every sleepless night worth it. Back at the base, I submitted detailed reports of the operation, noting the challenges and deviations from standard procedures. Admiral Warren reviewed the documents personally, commending the efficiency and moral clarity displayed by our teams. He emphasized that no reprimand would ever be issued for judgment exercised in the protection of life, a formal recognition of what had been informally understood as the Samaritan Rule. Over the following week, we managed multiple operations across the flood zone. Hospitals were supplied with essential medicines, elderly residents evacuated from isolated homes, and temporary shelters stocked with food, water, and medical supplies. Each mission reinforced the idea that effective leadership combines planning, discipline, and humanity. One evening, after returning from a 12-hour deployment, I walked along the pier, the sky painted with streaks of orange and violet. The storm had passed, leaving the harbor calm, the water reflecting the colors of twilight. I thought of Route 58, of the family whose lives I had saved, and of every officer now learning that protocol alone is insufficient when human lives are at stake. Chief Morales joined me, leaning against the railing. "You've turned this base into something different, Commander," he said quietly. "People see the difference between following rules and leading with judgment. It's subtle, but it matters more than they realize." I nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. "It's not just me, Chief, it's the team. Everyone trusted their instincts, followed their training, and acted when needed." The seed was Route 58, but the growth belongs to all of us. Weeks later, during a base-wide briefing, Admiral Warren addressed the assembled officers. His voice carried a calm authority, the weight of decades of service behind every word. "The Navy runs on orders, but it survives on judgment. We cannot punish conscience. We cannot ignore humanity. The actions of one officer on Route 58 serve as a template for moral courage. Every officer must understand that protocol exists to serve life, not replace it. The room was silent, officers absorbing the lesson. Some whispered quietly to one another, some straightened in respect. I remained at attention, humbled by the recognition but focused on the work ahead. Leadership was not about accolades, it was about the steady commitment to doing right, even in the darkest storms. Later that week, I received a secure message. It was from Captain Rhett Briggs. He had requested a meeting, not for reprimand, not for apology, but to discuss collaboration. Commander Hayes, his message read, "Your leadership has reshaped my understanding of responsibility. I am seeking a role in the Red Cross to apply real-world logistics under crisis conditions. I want to learn from the model you've implemented." I smiled quietly. The man who had once reprimanded me now sought guidance from the principles Route 58 had instilled: courage, judgment, and empathy. Change had a slow, deliberate rhythm, but it came even in those who had resisted it most. Months later, Admiral Warren visited the base for the anniversary of Project Samaritan. The ceremony was simple: no bands, no speeches, only officers walking through the hangar, inspecting vehicles, and acknowledging the human impact of our missions. He paused at the truck bearing the Samaritan emblem. "You did this," he said softly. "One act of decency built a doctrine. The Navy and the lives it touches are safer because of choices made in the storm." I shook my head. "We followed the map you drew, sir." He chuckled, eyes crinkling. "Maps are useless without someone brave enough to drive the road. You've ensured that future officers understand the balance between orders and conscience. That is your legacy." Evenings became reflective, moments of quiet clarity amidst the chaos of ongoing operations. I would sit by the pier, watching ships drift across the golden horizon, thinking of Route 58, hurricanes, floods, and every officer learning to trust their judgment. Each storm reinforced the lessons we lived by: action tempered by morality, discipline guided by humanity. One particularly calm night, as the harbor mirrored a sky full of stars, Admiral Warren joined me on the pier. "You understand, Commander," he said, voice low, steady. "That leadership is not about power. It's about integrity, judgment, and humanity. One choice made correctly can echo far beyond what we see." That night on Route 58, that choice has changed lives, policies, and the culture of this base. I nodded, remembering the rain, the chains, the child's eyes. "I just did what anyone should have done, sir." He smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement carrying decades of understanding. Sometimes that's all it takes. That act of courage, it matters more than any report, any rank, any medal. Never forget that. Months passed. The Navy faced hurricanes, floods, and emergencies across the East Coast, each time guided by the principles Route 58 had solidified. Officers acted decisively, balancing procedure with humanity, discipline with conscience. I continued to lead Project Samaritan, overseeing teams, coordinating logistics, and ensuring every life touched by our missions was protected. One afternoon, I received a letter from a young officer. "Commander Hayes, I was inspired by the case study of Route 58. I now understand the value of moral courage in operational decisions. Thank you for showing that leadership is more than following orders." I placed it on my desk alongside the framed photo of my truck and the stranded SUV, the silver rain threads captured forever. Every mission, every storm, every life saved had reaffirmed the principle: one act of conscience can ripple through an entire chain of command. Evenings at the base became moments of reflection. Standing on the pier, watching the sun set over the water, I thought of every officer, every civilian, every storm, and every decision that had brought me here. Leadership was measured not in accolades, but in moral courage, the willingness to act when it mattered most. The storms continued to come, but I no longer feared them. Each bolt of lightning, each gust of wind, reminded me of the responsibility carried in uniform and the moral compass necessary to navigate the impossible. Route 58 was no longer a single memory. It was a guide, a testament, and a foundation for generations of officers to come. The year closed with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The Navy had changed, our missions had saved lives, and the culture of the base had shifted subtly but irrevocably. The seeds planted in that dark, rainy night had grown into a doctrine of conscience and courage. And as I stood on the pier one final evening, watching the harbor reflect the colors of sunset, I whispered softly, "Do the right thing, even when no one is watching." Because in the Navy, as in life, the storms may be relentless, but courage, integrity, and conscience guide the way. The next morning, sunlight streamed across Norfolk Base with a promise of clarity, the kind that follows nights filled with storm and chaos. I arrived at Project Samaritan's command center, the scent of diesel, paper, and coffee mingling in the air. My team was already at work, reviewing supply manifests and plotting routes for our next humanitarian missions. Maps were spread across tables, radios buzzing with intermittent updates from field teams. The rhythm of the base felt alive, purposeful, a living testament to the lessons learned from Route 58. Chief Laram approached, holding a folder of new operational reports. "Commander Hayes," she began, voice formal but carrying a hint of admiration, "we have hurricane warnings along the eastern seaboard. Flood-prone regions will need immediate attention. Your oversight will be critical in ensuring timely deployments and resource allocation." I nodded, surveying the room. Officers and enlisted personnel moved efficiently, a combination of training, discipline, and instinct guiding every decision. I thought back to my own early days in the Navy, the tension of following orders strictly, fearing reprimand. Those fears had been replaced with something deeper, the assurance that moral judgment was as essential as technical skill. By mid-morning, we were coordinating with local emergency management teams. Bridges and roads had been washed out, shelters were overcrowded. I called up live satellite feeds and updated convoy routes to avoid hazards. Radios crackled constantly, officers reporting progress, unexpected obstacles, and weather updates. Each decision required balance, speed and caution, urgency and safety, procedure and judgment. Around noon, a call came through from a remote village. Rising floodwaters were threatening an elderly couple trapped on the second floor of their home. Roads were impassable by standard vehicles. Without hesitation, I dispatched an amphibious transport unit, coordinating rescue divers and medics. I personally monitored the operation, every heartbeat tethered to the safety of civilians, every instruction guided by experience and conscience. The divers navigated a treacherous current, the wind slicing against them like shards of ice. I watched through binoculars as the couple clung to a balcony railing, water swirling menacingly below. With steady hands, the divers secured them, lifting them into the safety of our transport vehicle. Relief washed through me when the couple was safely brought to dry ground. The husband clasped my hand tightly. "We thought no one would come," he said, voice quivering. "Thank you." Later, back at base, Admiral Warren personally reviewed the operations reports. His gaze, calm and discerning, met mine. "Commander Hayes," he said quietly, "your teams are demonstrating the value of integrated judgment and operational expertise. Lives are being saved because of one officer's choice on Route 58. That decision has reverberated far beyond what most can comprehend." I felt a sense of humility. It wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about ensuring that every life under our care was protected, that each mission reinforced the principle that humanity could never be secondary to procedure. As afternoon settled, we prepared for the next deployment. Another storm system was approaching, this one stronger and faster moving. Our teams would need to act preemptively, delivering supplies to shelters and vulnerable communities before the worst hit. I reviewed maps, calculated fuel loads, and coordinated communications, every action informed by countless hours of field experience and careful moral consideration. That evening, as I walked along the pier, the setting sun glinting off the water, I reflected on how far the base had come. Officers now moved with confidence, understanding the balance between following orders and exercising judgment. Conversations about protocol included discussions of conscience. Mistakes were analyzed not just for efficiency, but for ethical clarity. Route 58 had become more than a story, it had become a standard, an ethos guiding the entire operational culture. Chief Morales joined me again, leaning on the railing. "You've shifted something here, Commander," he said quietly, watching the harbor lights twinkle in the distance. "People see now that courage isn't loud, it's steady, deliberate, and informed by judgment. You've reminded them that we're sailors, not automatons." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "It's not just my work," I replied softly. "The team, the leadership, the willingness to act responsibly, this has been a collective effort. But yes, that night, it set the tone." Weeks turned into months, and the impact of Route 58 continued to echo across Norfolk Base. Project Samaritan became a model for humanitarian logistics operations throughout the Navy. Officers and enlisted personnel alike learned that timely action combined with moral judgment could save lives and transform operational culture. One morning, as I reviewed field reports, I received a message marked priority. It was from a young lieutenant assigned to our East Coast teams. "Commander Hayes, I wanted to thank you for demonstrating how leadership balances orders with moral courage. My team faced a scenario similar to Route 58 yesterday. We followed your example and saved a family stranded by floodwaters. Your leadership has changed how we think about responsibility." I folded the message carefully, the weight of its meaning settling on me. Route 58 had started as a stormy, terrifying night. It had evolved into a living lesson, shaping officers, rescuing lives, and guiding operational protocols. Every mission I oversaw carried that imprint, every choice measured not just in procedure but in conscience. Months later, Admiral Warren visited the base again. This time, there was no ceremony, no speeches, only quiet inspection of Project Samaritan's operations. We walked through the hangars, the smell of diesel and wet earth filling the air. Trucks, amphibious vehicles, and helicopters were prepped, their maintenance logs updated, every crew member briefed. "You've done more than create a program," the Admiral said, his voice calm but resonant. "You've changed the culture. Your decision on Route 58 has become doctrine. Officers act with judgment. Lives are prioritized. Integrity is reinforced." I looked at him, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "It's all the teams, sir," I said. "I made a choice that night, but it's the people following through every day that make the difference." He nodded, eyes reflecting the depth of his understanding. Leadership is not about making choices in isolation. It's about fostering an environment where moral courage can flourish. "You've done that, Commander." Later, as I walked the pier under a sky painted in twilight, I thought again of Route 58, the family, the chains, the rain-soaked night that had tested everything. The memory was no longer a weight but a compass, guiding every decision, every mission, and every act of leadership. One evening, a hurricane swept through the Carolinas. Roads were impassable, power lines down, homes submerged. I led a convoy into the storm, coordinating rescue operations, supply distribution, and emergency medical response. Each step required balancing risk with necessity, strategy with empathy. Radios buzzed constantly, officers reporting progress, improvising solutions, and maintaining calm. During the operation, we rescued dozens of families trapped by rising waters, delivered critical supplies to hospitals, and ensured that every vulnerable person had access to shelter. I drove alongside the teams, my hands steady on the wheel, every action infused with the lessons learned from that stormy night on Route 58. After the hurricane, as I stood on the pier watching the calm return to the water, I received a handwritten note from Admiral Warren. "Commander Hayes, your leadership exemplifies the balance between duty and conscience. Project Samaritan continues because of your courage and clarity. Thank you for showing what leadership truly means." I pinned the note to the wall beside the framed photo of my truck and the stranded SUV. The silver streaks of rain frozen in time reminded me of every choice, every risk, every act of humanity that had defined my career in Project Samaritan. Weeks later, I found myself back on Route 58. The road was quiet, sunlight glinting off the asphalt. I parked briefly, stepping out to breathe in the scent of rain and pine. I thought of the family whose lives I had saved, of the countless officers inspired by that night, and of the principle that had guided every mission since: courage and conscience in equal measure. Standing there, I whispered softly, "Do the right thing, even when no one is watching." The words carried over the highway, over fields and rivers, over every life touched by that decision. Route 58 was no longer just a place. It was a reminder that one moment of moral courage could resonate far beyond what anyone could measure. Months passed, storms came and went, and Project Samaritan continued to flourish. Officers were trained not only in procedure but in judgment, empathy, and moral courage. Every deployment carried the imprint of Route 58, ensuring that lives were protected, dignity upheld, and humanity never secondary to protocol. Late one evening, as I watched the sun sink below the horizon from the pier, Admiral Warren joined me once more. "You understand, Commander," he said, voice calm and warm, "that the Navy is more than ships, orders, and strategy. It survives on people like you. Decisions made in conscience, not fear, define the institution and protect the lives entrusted to it." I nodded, feeling the weight and significance of every choice made, every risk taken, every life saved. "Sir, I'll continue to ensure that every officer under Project Samaritan understands that principle." He smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey we had undertaken together. "And they will, because of you." The sun dipped fully below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water. I stood quietly, letting the wind carry the scent of salt, diesel, and possibility. The storms would continue, challenges would come, but the lesson was clear. Leadership is measured not by adherence to orders alone, but by the courage to act rightly when it matters most. I turned back toward Norfolk Base, the framed photo of the stranded SUV and my truck ever present in my mind. Route 58 had become more than memory. It had become doctrine, guiding every mission, every officer, and every decision. I whispered again, not to anyone, not even to myself fully, "Do the right thing, even when no one is watching." And for the first time, I knew that the lesson would outlast me, shaping officers, missions, and lives long after the storm had passed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning, coordination, and reflection. I spent hours at the command center, monitoring storm patterns along the East Coast and ensuring Project Samaritan's teams were ready for deployment. Every phone call, every radio transmission, every decision carried the weight of lives depending on our efficiency and judgment. The memory of Route 58 was never far from my mind, a silent reminder of why humanity and protocol must sometimes coexist in delicate balance. One afternoon, as I reviewed supply manifests for an upcoming hurricane relief mission in North Carolina, Chief Laram approached with a folder. "Commander Hayes," she said, her tone formal yet warm, "these are the logistical breakdowns from our last 3 missions. There are anomalies in fuel usage and delivery times that need your attention. Admiral Warren requested you personally review them before his next visit." I nodded, already absorbed in the data. Each number told a story, some encouraging, some cautionary. I identified inefficiencies, recommended route adjustments, and prepared contingency plans. The team trusted my judgment. The experience from that stormy night had cemented not only my credibility, but also the importance of moral clarity in decision-making. By evening, the base was quiet, the hum of generators and distant engines the only reminders of ongoing operations. I walked the pier, the water reflecting the amber glow of the setting sun. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and diesel, a combination that had become intimately familiar over the years. I reflected on the young officers now under my command. Many had faced moral dilemmas for the first time, and some had hesitated to act. Project Samaritan was not just about logistics, it was about teaching courage and conscience in equal measure. As night fell, a call came from a field team stationed near a coastal town. Flooding had stranded several families on the upper floors of their homes. Roads were impassable and swift action was required. I activated the amphibious transport units, coordinating rescue divers and medics with meticulous precision. The operation was tense. Winds lashed against the vehicles, rain poured in sheets, and the currents in the flooded streets churned with unpredictable intensity. Officers relayed updates through radios, voices cracking over static. I maintained calm, issuing instructions, improvising solutions, and balancing the urgency of the mission with the safety of our personnel. Every decision was guided by experience, instinct, and conscience. By midnight, all the families were safely evacuated. An elderly woman clasped my hand tightly as she stepped onto dry ground. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. "We thought no one would come." Her words brought back the memory of the man, his wife, and child on Route 58. I felt a profound sense of continuity, the thread of moral courage connecting past and present. The next morning, Admiral Warren arrived unannounced for a follow-up inspection. His presence was calm, authoritative, yet devoid of any unnecessary ceremony. He walked through the command center, observing the efficiency and coordination of the teams. When his gaze met mine, it was steady, measuring, yet unmistakably approving. "Commander Hayes," he said quietly, "your teams have exceeded expectations." Project Samaritan is functioning at a level I hoped for, but seeing it in action confirms that leadership guided by conscience produces tangible results. Tell me, what did you emphasize in your training? I hesitated, then spoke plainly. Sir, I emphasize the importance of judgment alongside protocol. Rules exist for a reason, but sometimes lives are at stake, and officers must be empowered to act decisively and morally. We review scenarios, discuss options, and cultivate a sense of responsibility that goes beyond the manual. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Good. Very few officers understand that distinction. Many follow orders without question and lose sight of why those orders exist. You've created a culture where discipline and humanity coexist. Later, as I walked the pier with Chief Morales, I reflected on how far we had come. The base had shifted subtly but profoundly. Officers approached missions with confidence, understanding that while protocol guided them, conscience protected the people they served. Mistakes were analyzed not only for operational efficiency but also for ethical clarity. Route 58 was no longer just a memory, it had become a standard, a living lesson embedded in the culture of Project Samaritan. Weeks passed and Project Samaritan grew. New teams were integrated and collaboration with local emergency management agencies expanded. I personally oversaw each deployment, ensuring that every mission reinforced the principle that lives were paramount, that moral courage was as essential as technical skill. One evening, a storm warning came in for the Carolinas. Rivers were swelling, homes threatened by rising waters. I coordinated the deployment of multiple convoys, amphibious vehicles, and medical teams. Radios crackled with updates, roads blocked, power lines down, and families trapped. Each instruction required precision, foresight, and compassion. Every officer had to make decisions in real time, guided not only by orders but by conscience. During the operation, a young lieutenant encountered a family trapped in their attic. The water had risen rapidly, and the standard protocol would have required waiting for a backup unit. Remembering my experience on Route 58, he acted decisively, coordinating a rescue without waiting for approval. By the time I arrived on the scene, the family was safe, thanks to the lieutenant's moral courage. Later, back at the base, I received a message from Admiral Warren. Commander Hayes, the report from your field teams shows exemplary judgment under pressure. You've built a culture where officers act morally and efficiently, continue to lead by example. I pinned the message beside the photo from Route 58, the silver streaks of rain frozen in time. It served as a reminder that leadership was not about recognition, but about ensuring that every decision protected life and upheld human dignity. Months later, Project Samaritan's protocols were formally integrated into Navy training manuals. Officers were trained not only in procedure but in judgment, empathy, and moral courage. Every mission carried the imprint of Route 58, ensuring that lives were protected, dignity upheld, and humanity never secondary to protocol. One quiet evening, as I watched the sun set over the harbor, Admiral Warren joined me on the pier. Commander Hayes, he said softly, you understand now that the Navy is more than ships, orders, and strategy. It survives on people like you, decisions made in conscience, not fear. I nodded, feeling the significance of every choice, every risk, every life saved. Sir, I will continue to ensure that every officer under Project Samaritan understands that principle. He smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey we had undertaken together. And they will, because of you. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water. I stood quietly, letting the wind carry the scent of salt, diesel, and possibility. The storms would continue, challenges would come, but the lesson was clear. Leadership is measured not by adherence to orders alone, but by the courage to act rightly when it matters most. Later that week, a major hurricane struck the eastern seaboard. Project Samaritan deployed immediately. I drove alongside the convoys, coordinating rescues, distributing supplies, and ensuring communication channels remained open. Families trapped by floodwaters, hospitals in need of fuel and medical supplies, and countless lives at risk all depended on the efficiency and judgment of our teams. Each rescue reinforced the principle that had guided me since Route 58, that moral courage was inseparable from leadership. Officers followed protocol but were empowered to act when lives were at stake. Every decision was deliberate, every action purposeful. By the time the hurricane subsided, hundreds of lives had been saved, infrastructure damage mitigated, and the human spirit reaffirmed. Months passed. Project Samaritan became a model for humanitarian operations throughout the Navy. Officers were trained to weigh orders against conscience, to act decisively when necessary, and to understand that true leadership was defined by moral courage. One afternoon, I received a letter from Captain Rhett Briggs, my former rival. "Commander Hayes, I have seen the impact of your leadership and the culture you have instilled at Norfolk Base. I was wrong in my judgment. Thank you for showing me what real leadership entails. I have applied for a volunteer position with the Red Cross to better understand humanitarian logistics. Perhaps someday I can emulate even a fraction of what you've achieved." I set the letter down slowly, feeling closure for past conflicts. The memory of Route 58, once a night of fear and chaos, had become a cornerstone of moral courage and operational excellence. Later, Admiral Warren visited the base for the first anniversary of Project Samaritan. There was no ceremony, no speeches, only a quiet tour of the hangars. Trucks gleamed under the lights, personnel moved with purpose, and every vehicle bore the emblem of Project Samaritan. "You did this," he said softly. "You took one act of decency and built a doctrine." I shook my head. "No, sir, you did. You empowered the culture. I just followed your guidance." He chuckled. "Maps are useless without someone brave enough to drive the road. You are that someone, Commander Hayes." As we stood by the pier watching the sun sink beyond the horizon, he added, "Many people pass through life without realizing the difference they make. You, however, acted in the storm, and that has changed countless lives. The Navy survives on people like you, Commander." I nodded, words unnecessary. I saluted, and he returned it with a crisp, perfect gesture, eyes glimmering with respect and acknowledgement. Months later, while responding to another hurricane, I found myself on Route 58 once more. The road was calm, sunlight reflecting off the asphalt. I parked briefly, stepping out to breathe in the familiar scent of rain and pine. I thought of the family whose lives I had saved, the officers inspired by that night, and the principle that had guided every mission since: courage and conscience in equal measure. Standing there, I whispered softly, "Do the right thing, even when no one is watching." The words carried over the highway, over fields and rivers, over every life touched by that decision. Route 58 was no longer just a place. It was a testament to the power of moral courage, a legacy embedded in the Navy's culture and the hearts of every officer who followed. The morning after the hurricane, Norfolk Base was alive with activity. Convoys returned, teams reported on their missions, and the logistical data streamed in from field units. Project Samaritan had proven its effectiveness once again, not only in efficiency, but in demonstrating the impact of moral courage. Officers, once hesitant, were now confident, empowered by the knowledge that decisive action guided by conscience would always be recognized. I walked the perimeter of the base, boots echoing against the concrete, and watched the sun rise over the harbor. Ships lay anchored in orderly lines, steel hulls glinting in the light, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly aligned. But beneath the surface, I knew the real measure of leadership wasn't visible in statistics or rankings. It was in the lives touched, the families saved, and the officers inspired to act rightly under pressure. Admiral Warren's presence remained a quiet but steady influence. He had instilled a principle into the very framework of the base, that rules were vital, but they were tools for service, not chains to stifle judgment. In our conversations, he often spoke of the difference between obedience and understanding, discipline and empathy. Every interaction was a lesson, every directive a challenge to balance protocol with conscience. That afternoon, I received a call from a newly assigned officer who had joined the humanitarian operations team. Her voice was tentative, yet there was urgency. "Commander Hayes, there's a town near the Outer Banks that's reporting flooding and several homes without power. Some residents are elderly and can't evacuate easily. What's the protocol?" I smiled faintly, recalling my own early days in the Navy, standing at the edge of impossible decisions. "We prioritize human life first," I replied firmly. "Coordinate with your team, assess risks, and act decisively. Remember, protocol guides us, but judgment saves lives. Keep me updated." As I hung up, Chief Morales appeared, leaning against the doorway, his hands still slightly stained with oil from vehicle inspections. "Commander, looks like your philosophy is spreading," he said with a chuckle. Officers aren't just following orders, they're thinking. You've changed how people operate here. I nodded, watching a convoy leave the base, trucks loaded with supplies, officers prepared to make difficult decisions in the field. The memory of Route 58 came rushing back, the storm, the stranded family, the weight of responsibility. That night had been a defining moment, not only for me but for the culture I was now entrusted to shape. Later that week, Admiral Warren requested a personal briefing. His office overlooked the harbor, sunlight reflecting off the waves and casting patterns across the polished floor. "Commander Hayes," he began, "Project Samaritan has exceeded expectations in both scope and execution. I've been reviewing reports from the field, and officers are performing beyond what I anticipated. Your influence is clear." I felt a quiet pride but remained grounded. "Sir, it's the teams who deserve credit. I provide guidance, but they execute. Every officer has the ability to act morally and decisively. I just ensure they understand that principle." He smiled, eyes softening with the weight of experience. "That is leadership, not directing every move, but instilling judgment, confidence, and moral clarity. Route 58 was a catalyst, yes, but your consistent guidance has made it doctrine." The conversation shifted to future plans. The Navy intended to integrate the Samaritan Rule formally into training across multiple bases. Officers would now be evaluated not just on adherence to protocol, but on the soundness of their judgment in humanitarian operations. My role was to oversee the rollout, mentoring new teams, developing training modules, and ensuring that every deployment balanced efficiency with ethical responsibility. That evening, I walked alone along the pier. The harbor was tranquil, the water reflecting the fiery hues of sunset. I thought of the families we had helped, the young officers growing into roles of responsibility, and the countless small decisions that, when guided by conscience, created a ripple effect far beyond what anyone could anticipate. A gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and diesel, a reminder of the duality of service, hardship, and purpose intertwined. I remembered Admiral Warren's words, "The Navy survives on people like you." The weight of the statement settled over me, a quiet affirmation that courage and integrity mattered as much as any strategy or operation plan. Weeks later, a commemorative ceremony was held in the hangar. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't meant for ceremony or acclaim. Sailors gathered, small but meaningful, to honor the launch of Project Samaritan's official doctrine. Admiral Warren spoke briefly, his voice calm but commanding. "Every rule exists to guide us. But when rules fail to account for the human condition, judgment and conscience must prevail." Commander Hayes exemplifies that principle. "Let every officer present remember, moral courage is as essential as discipline and humanity as vital as efficiency." As he spoke, I scanned the room, noticing officers nodding, some teary-eyed, some contemplative. The impact of one night on Route 58 had grown exponentially, shaping not only my career but the culture of an entire base. Leadership, I realized, was not measured by accolades but by influence, by the moral fiber instilled in those who followed. After the ceremony, I returned to my office. On my desk, framed under the warm glow of the lamp, was the photo from Route 58, the truck headlights cutting through rain, the stranded SUV beside it, silver threads of rain frozen in time. On the back, Admiral Warren's careful handwriting, "For when the storms return, so you remember what courage looks like in the dark." I traced the frame lightly, remembering every detail of that night, the fear, the decision, the humanity. That moment had defined my career, yet it had also defined something larger, a standard of moral courage embedded into every action, every mission, every officer under Project Samaritan. Months passed. Hurricanes, floods, and emergencies tested the teams constantly, yet the culture endured. Officers acted with initiative, families were saved, and the principles of conscience guiding action became a hallmark of operations. I traveled to various bases, training officers, reviewing operations, and ensuring that the Samaritan Rule was applied consistently. Each deployment reinforced the lesson that protocol without judgment is hollow, judgment without moral compass is dangerous. One quiet evening, I received a message from an elderly woman rescued during the Carolinas floods. "Commander Hayes, thanks to you and your teams, our family survived. Your decision long before has saved countless lives. You've made the Navy a better place." Her words reminded me why I had chosen to stop on Route 58, why I had acted despite fear and potential repercussions. Sometimes the right choice is unseen, uncelebrated, yet its impact is profound. I pinned the letter beside the photo, a tangible reminder of lives changed by moral courage. Later, Admiral Warren visited for the first anniversary of Project Samaritan. No ceremony, no speeches, just a quiet walk through the hangars, observing operations. "You took one act of decency and built a doctrine," he said softly. "I only followed the path you laid out, sir," I replied, humbled. He chuckled. "Maps are meaningless without someone brave enough to drive the road. You are that someone, Commander Hayes. Never forget the difference one choice can make." As we stood by the pier, watching the sun sink below the horizon, he added, "Many people pass through life unaware of their impact. You acted in the storm, and that choice rippled through the lives of countless people, officers and civilians alike. The Navy is stronger because of you." I saluted, words unnecessary, and he returned it with the same crisp, perfect gesture. That evening, the harbor glowed gold, the flag fluttered in the breeze, and for the first time I felt a complete sense of closure and purpose. Months later, responding to another hurricane, I drove the lead convoy. Roads flooded, families displaced, communities in peril. Yet I drove with the knowledge that every officer under my command was empowered to act, guided by moral judgment as well as protocol. Lives were saved, and each successful mission reinforced the principle that courage in the face of uncertainty defines true leadership. One afternoon, I received a handwritten note from Captain Rhett Briggs. "Commander Hayes, you've shown me what leadership truly entails. I was wrong. I'm learning to prioritize conscience alongside protocol. Thank you." I set the note beside the framed photo on my desk. Route 58 had transformed from a moment of fear into a symbol of moral courage, a reminder of why every officer must sometimes choose humanity over rigid adherence to rules. Standing on the pier that evening, watching the sun set over calm waters, I whispered softly to the memory of every storm, every decision, every life touched. Do the right thing, even when no one is watching. The storms would come again, as they always do, but the lesson was clear and the path forward unambiguous. Project Samaritan thrived because officers acted with conscience, decisions were made with moral courage, and humanity was never secondary to protocol. And somewhere on a stretch of highway much like Route 58, someone else might face a storm. They would remember the principle embedded in the culture, in the doctrine, in the story, and they would act. Courage, I realized, was not an isolated act. It was a chain, a legacy, a beacon for others to follow. I returned to my office, the framed photo catching the last light of day. My pen hovered over the next mission order. I wrote with purpose, with clarity, and with the knowledge that leadership is not simply about following orders. It is about knowing when to follow the heart. For older Americans who had worn the uniform, for young officers learning the meaning of duty, and for anyone who has faced a storm and wondered whether to act, this story belongs to you. It is a testament that kindness, courage, and moral clarity are the truest measures of honor. And when the storms return, as they inevitably will, may you remember Route 58 and the courage it inspired.